Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts.
Final remarks. We'll begin with you, Dr. Ehrman.
Our ultimate question comes down to whether the Gospels are reliable or not. My view is that the Gospels have mistakes, discrepancies, contradictions, factual errors, textual alterations, additions, omissions, and corruptions in them. This is not a unique view of a particularly liberal professor who teaches at Chapel Hill. I know that I seem very liberal. When we were talking about the format for this debate, I asked that I be given the podium on the left. This view that I am setting forth, though, is not the view of just a liberal professor. It is virtually the consensus view among critical scholars across the United States and Europe. If you don't believe me, let me tell you a few striking facts that I don't think Craig will deny. This view that the New Testament Gospels contain discrepancies and errors is the view shared by the New Testament scholars who teach at all the major universities of this country. It is the view that is taught of every New Testament scholar who teaches at Ivy League schools, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Brown, Columbia, Cornell, University of Pennsylvania. I know these people. It is the view of professors of New Testament at all the major state universities in this country. Where I live in the East, the University of Florida, Florida State, University of Georgia, all 14 of the universities in my state, North Carolina, University of Virginia, University of Maryland, Rutgers University. It's the view of every New Testament scholar who teaches at major universities in the Midwest, where you live. At the University of Texas, the University of Oklahoma, the University of Kansas, University of Nebraska, the University of Iowa, and so on. It is the view of professors at New Testament in every major divinity school connected with a great university in this country. Harvard, Yale, Duke, Vanderbilt, Emory, University of Chicago, as well as the mainline seminaries not connected with the university. Princeton Theological Seminary, Claremont, the Graduate Theological Union, and on and on and on. These are not my idiosyncratic views. These views are taught at virtually every institution of higher learning in the entire world that is not fundamentalist or evangelical Christian. Most of these people teaching these views are themselves Christian, but they don't have an evangelical assumption that the Bible is without mistake. The only ones who say otherwise are fundamentalists or conservative evangelical Christians. How can that be? Is everyone else, apart from evangelicals, not as intelligent? Are they blind? Are they demonically inspired? Everyone else? How is it that the only ones who think differently, the only ones who think that the Bible is completely reliable, are people who have a particular theological point of view that affirms that the Bible does not have mistakes in it? This is a theological view, not a historical view. And people are, of course, welcome to have it. But the people who have it should admit that when they say the Bible is reliable, they are saying so not on historical grounds for historical reasons. They are saying so because their theological views require them to say it. If they did not have these theological views, they would agree with everyone else, Christian and non-Christian, that the Bible does not provide a reliable account of the historical Jesus and of the history of the early Christian church. Let me tell you why I think it matters. Many good Bible-believing Christians think that the Bible provides a blueprint for faith and ethics, for how you should believe, what you should believe, and how you should live. Questions over such things as abortion, gun control, gay rights, that the Bible provides us the blueprint. The problem is the Bible is not a single book. The Bible is a lot of books written by a lot of different authors who have a lot of different points of view that disagree with one another. This means that we should not be dogmatic about what we think and insist that what we think is what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches lots of different things. The Bible welcomes lots of different views, and we should too. I once thought that the Gospels were completely reliable. Now I no longer think so. It's not that I decided to jump on the scholarly bandwagon and abandon my evangelical faith. I looked long and hard at the evidence. I studied it for years. I grappled with it. I prayed over it. I talked it over with friends and loved ones. And eventually I came to see the truth. The Bible does not provide a reliable account of the things Jesus said and did. I know most of you will not change your mind. But I hope you realize that people like me come to this question honestly and openly, not trying to destroy the faith of others, but simply searching for the truth. I hope you too will be honest and open and not be afraid to go wherever the truth seems to lead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's push this further. This isn't just one professor's opinion. This is the consensus across real scholarship. Universities like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, these aren't fringe groups. These are the top experts in history and ancient texts, and they agree. The Gospels have contradictions, edits, and errors. So what does Justin do? He leans on belief, not evidence. Because when you actually follow the data, the claim that the Bible is perfectly reliable falls apart. And here's the key point. Who are the only people still saying the Bible has no mistakes? Evangelicals who already believe it must be true. That's not history. That's bias. You start with the conclusion, then force the evidence to fit. Even inside the Bible, authors disagree. Different teachings, different details, different agendas. This isn't one clear message, it's a collection of conflicting voices.
Question number 4. Do the Gospels contain eyewitness tradition?
When I was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, attending Moody Bible Institute, before I began my serious scholarship on the New Testament, before I began to read it in Greek, and before I saw what serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was absolutely convinced that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, but that they were written by 2 eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by 2 people who were close companions to people who were eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things. But I don't want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this. God gave you a brain to think with. Apply reason. That's why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous, and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody. Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right, but even if they did, it wouldn't matter because the Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact, they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
Let's be honest. There is zero solid evidence that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. They don't even claim to be, not once. They're anonymous texts. The names were added later, about 100 years after Jesus. That's not testimony. That's tradition layered on top of stories. And think about this. Jesus spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek by educated authors living decades later in different regions. These are not the disciples. These are later writers repeating stories they heard. Then you look at the contradictions. Who went to the tomb? 1 woman, 2 women, or a group? What did they see? 1 angel or 2? The resurrection story, the most important claim, doesn't even match across the 4 Gospels. Even Luke admits he's not an eyewitness. He says he's compiling accounts from others. So ask yourself, if this were any other religion making these claims with anonymous authors, decades of storytelling, and conflicting reports, would you believe it? Or would you call it unreliable?
Question number 5. Do archaeologists and historians use the Gospels as sources?
It's very easy to answer the question whether the archaeologists use the Gospels as sources. The answer is flat out no. Archaeologists dig to find material remains from antiquity, and their digs are not based on the study of literary texts such as the New Testament Gospels, as any bona fide archaeologist will tell you. But historians, of course, do use the Gospels as sources, principally as sources for knowing about the life of the historical Jesus. They have to because there are no other sources that are reliable that exist, which leaves us with a problem, since the only sources that do exist are the Gospels, and they're not reliable either. There's no doubt that the historical Jesus is the most important person in the history of Western civilization. There is no doubt of that at all, in my opinion. But the unfortunate thing about Jesus is that we have such scanty documentation about his life. Most people don't realize this. But Jesus is never mentioned in any Greek or Roman non-Christian source until 80 years after his death. There is no record of Jesus having lived in these sources. In the entire first Christian century, Jesus is not mentioned by a single Greek or Roman historian, religion scholar, politician, philosopher, or poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, and it is never found in a single piece of private correspondence. Zero, zip, references. The first time Jesus is mentioned in a Roman source or a Greek source is by the Roman governor of a province of Asia Minor, a governor named Pliny, in the year 112, 80 years after Jesus' death. And even then, Pliny doesn't even name him Jesus. He simply refers to his name Christ in passing. That is the only reference within 80 years of Jesus' death. Jesus is mentioned 2 times, very, very briefly, by the Jewish historian Josephus in the year 93, over 60 years after his death, but he's mentioned in no other Jewish source of the first century at all. If you want to know about Jesus, you have to turn to Christian sources. There is no choice. The earliest Christian source is the Apostle Paul. But to the surprise of many Bible readers, Paul scarcely mentions anything about Jesus' words and deeds while he was living. He says a lot about Jesus' death and resurrection, but almost nothing about his words and deeds while alive. Which means if you want to know about the words and deeds of Jesus, the earliest sources are the Gospels. But these are filled, absolutely filled with discrepancies, historical mistakes, errors, contradictions, stories that have been changed and rechanged and changed yet again in the process of telling and retelling before the Gospel writers living 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus' life were able to write them down. Craig has said, well, eyewitnesses are still alive, so they'd be able to check the accuracy of the stories being told. I've never understood this argument, even though I've heard it for 40 years. Christianity started out as a small group of Jesus followers in Jerusalem, right after his death. Within 30 years, there were Christian communities that were established throughout many of the urban areas of the Roman Empire. There were Christian churches in Palestine, in Syria, in Asia Minor, what we think of as Turkey, in Greece, in Rome, possibly in northern Africa, almost certainly in Alexandria, Egypt. Hundreds of people were converting. Thousands of people were converting. How did they convert? By people telling them stories about Jesus. Who was telling the stories? If I convert you, and you convert your wife, and your wife converts her next-door neighbor, and next-door neighbor converts her husband, and her husband converts a business associate who goes to another city and converts his business associate, who's telling the stories? Is it eyewitnesses? Are the 12 apostles of Jesus talking to everybody who's telling a story and saying, make sure you get that right? The eyewitnesses are probably in Jerusalem. Where are the eyewitnesses in Ephesus? Where are the eyewitnesses in Tarsus? Where are the eyewitnesses in Alexandria? They are not there. The stories are changed and rechanged over the years so that historians have to use these Gospels very carefully and critically because they don't contain eyewitness reports, and we can't assume that what they say is historically accurate.
If Christianity is true, where is the evidence outside the Bible? You're talking about someone claimed to be God, performing miracles, rising from the dead, and there's nothing. No records from Roman historians. No official documents, no eyewitness reports from outside believers, for decades. Not one mention in the entire first century from people who actually kept records. That should bother you. The first non-Christian reference shows up around 80 years later, and it's vague. That's not strong evidence. That's silence. So what are we left with? The Gospels. And those same Gospels are already full of contradictions and changes over time. Then you hear the claim, eyewitnesses would have corrected the stories. Really? Christianity spread across entire regions. Turkey, Greece, Rome, Egypt. Stories passed from person to person, city to city. There's no control, no verification. That's exactly how stories change. And that's exactly what we see.
Number 1, Dr. Ehrman, are the Gospels reliable?
In my view, there is certainly historically reliable information in the Gospels, of course. But there are also pieces of historically unreliable information. This can be seen by the fact that sometimes there are flat-out discrepancies between the Gospels. as you will see yourself if you just read them carefully side by side. Let me give you just a taste out of 1,000 examples. The Gospel of Matthew says that the father of Joseph, Jesus' father, was Jacob. His grandfather was Mathan, and his great-grandfather was Eleazar. The Gospel of Luke says that Joseph's father was Heli. His grandfather was Mathat, and his great-grandfather was Levi. Well, which was it? The genealogies differ. One of the key motives of the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus' disciples don't recognize him as the Messiah until chapter 8. But in the Gospel of John, they call him the Messiah right away, the first time they meet him in chapter 1. Which is it? How could it be both? There are small discrepancies between the Gospels, hundreds of them. Was Jairus' daughter sick but still alive when Jairus came to ask Jesus to heal her, as in Mark? Or did she just die before Jairus came, so that he asked Jesus to raise her from the dead, as in Matthew? Hard to see how it could be both ways. The Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of Mark says explicitly that Jesus died the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. Don't take my word for it. Read John 19 and Mark 15 for yourself. They contradict each other. Or look at the resurrection accounts in the 4 Gospels sometime and ask yourself, how many women went to the empty tomb? What were their names? Was the stone rolled away before the women arrived or after they got there? What did they see there? 1 man, 2 men, or 2 angels? What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? Did they tell the disciples or not? Did the disciples go to Galilee or not? It depends which gospel you read. You get a different story every time. We should not say that these are a bunch of details and don't affect the larger picture. The larger picture is made up of nothing but details. The big pictures are vastly different too, as you'll see once you allow yourself to admit that the details are all different up and down the line. In my opinion now, the accounts of the Gospels cannot be reliable because they differ in hundreds of ways, both big and small, and they contain numerous historical errors.
Look at Jesus' own family line. Matthew and Luke give completely different genealogies for Joseph. Not slightly different, totally different names. That's not a minor detail. That's the foundation of who Jesus is supposed to be. Look at the timeline of his death. Mark says Jesus dies after the Passover meal. John says he dies before it. That's a direct contradiction on one of the most important events in Christianity. Then the resurrection story, the core claim. How many women went to the tomb? What did they see? Who spoke to them? Did they tell anyone? Every gospel tells it differently. So after all of this, anonymous authors, contradictions, missing evidence, what do you actually trust? The data, or what you were taught growing up? I want to hear from you. Do you think the Gospels are reliable, or do these issues change how you see them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to like and subscribe.